Okay, thank you to the Walrus for inviting me to participate in this, and it's been a pleasure listening to the other panelists. So I'd like to begin by explaining how I came to this subject. I'm a journalist. I write about urban affairs and do a lot of transportation and mobility writing. But this particular topic has its origin in two experiences. One, I live just up the hill. For those of you who aren't in town, Toronto has a hill, sort of midtown, and I often go down the hill on my way downtown, and there's an underpass under a railway that cuts through the middle of the city, and there's a bike lane there. And frequently I will see people who live in a local long-term care facility in motorized scooters in the bike lane going under the railway tracks. And I always think that they must have nerves of steel because they're completely exposed to whatever goes on under that railway track. You know, people are driving down there, and there could be deep puddles, and it to me screams like it's a mistake that in our transportation system. So that's one source of this talk. The second is I'd like to do a shout out to Anthony Townsend, who I was interviewing a few months ago about another topic, and he said that he made this observation that a lot of people are talking about autonomous vehicles these days, as it's come up in this conference. But what and Townsend is he writes a lot about smart cities, and he's focusing on these things called personal mobility devices, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. And so I only have one slide, and this is it. And so I've offered a selection of personal mobility devices, and I want to talk a little bit about this market that's coming up. So I found a couple of headlines from Singapore, of all places, in the last couple of days, and I'll read them now. E-scooters banned from footpaths. Over 100 PMD riders get warnings. Riding on the paths, grass patches could be an offense. Another, e-scooter rider jailed for 5 days for crashing into a 6-year-old boy. Then a third, ban on personal mobility devices, ? The battle is always against errant use. So get used to this acronym, PMD, personal mobility device, because it describes a rapidly growing category of compact consumer products that are typically battery powered. They have onboard electronics. And they allow people an alternative way of getting around the city that's different from vehicular transportation, obviously different from transit, and unlike bicycles because they are powered by batteries. So in this city, there are lots of different ways of moving through urban space, but the means are fairly limited, right? And we know what they are. They're bikes, they're cars, they're transit vehicles, they're motorized scooters and motorized wheelchairs. But it's not a long list. But we've seen in recent years that the number of people who are using other types of devices has begun to grow. So I see people commuting on longboards frequently in the downtown area, and they're using the bike lanes, which is good. There are also places, I don't think this is permitted in Toronto, but there are places, and some of you have been to these places, where you could use segways, and often they're in malls or in their private enclosed spaces. I think that there are segways at the Distillery District. But the PMD market is about to explode, and it's going to transform this mix of devices that are operating on city streets. So in recent months in Toronto, we've seen reports that the e-scooter companies like Bird and Nest have been lobbying the City of Toronto quite aggressively to operate in the city. And recently there was a council committee decision to ban them from a key request, which was to be allowed to operate the scooters on sidewalks. The concept of e-scooters, for those of you who don't know it, is similar to the bike share idea, except that there's no docking station. And so you could book it on an app, and then you could leave it wherever you want. I have a colleague, the editorial director of Spacing, Matt Blackett, who recently visited Edmonton. I don't know if anyone's here is from Edmonton, but apparently there are a lot of e-scooters, and they're just all over the place. And so you just put them down when you no longer need it. I found a story online from the Evening Standard in UK which commented that micromobility, which is another way of describing this revolution, is coming quickly. Move over electric scooters. The future of transport is a motorized ball-shaped hoverboard. So this device it looks like a bowling ball that's kind of slightly deformed, and it's got two wings on it, and you stand on it, and it moves you around. And like a growing number of these devices, it's got sort of an auto-balancing feature. So there are actually bicycles now that can auto-balance themselves, and this is one of these devices. It's called the gyro ball, this object. It's about 9 kilometers in weight, and it's got approximately a 20-kilometer range, and it's a crowd-funded project. So imagine this for a moment. You've got a device that's going to carry you 20 kilometers. You don't have to, you don't have to ride 20 kilometers. You could just be driven by this thing. And so it changes your perception of distance and space significantly if you happen to own one of these objects. And there's a growing number of these. They're called autonomous scooters, self-balancing mono-wheel, rocket skates, winglet, and rocket cars. Some of them are attached to your feet. There are gadgets that will move your legs, or that you sort of put them on like rollerblades, but they're motorized. Some are modified scooters that you stand on, and there's a handlebar that you can use for navigation. There are more variations on the Segway. There are variations on the unicycle. These are battery powered. Some of them can be folded up, and some of them look like penguins or sort of science fiction devices, like a couple of these. A number of these are made by vehicle manufacturers. Honda, Volvo, Peugeot, Toyota are all getting into this space. And the reason is clear that, like the big oil and gas companies, it's a hedging strategy. They want to look at something different. And knowing that growing number of younger people are no longer buying cars. And so these are alternatives to moving through urban space in congested cities, and doing so in a way that allows you a longer range. And the way I'd like to close out this talk is to look at the trade-offs and the policy issues that accompany decisions about whether we should permit these uses and how. There's a discussion going on in the City of Toronto right now about sort of conflict over electric vehicles. There are lots of people who live downtown who don't have driveways but want to buy electric vehicles, so they want to put pad parking on their front lawns, so to put in so they can charge their cars. So what's better, more electric vehicles or getting rid of a permeable space in front of your house and possibly cutting down trees? So this is an example of the conflict between two competing goods that are sort of both sort of progressive values. And the same, I think, can be said of these devices. We don't really know where they should belong. So the City of Toronto said, we don't want e-scooters on the sidewalk because there are a fair number of examples of collisions that cause injuries to either pedestrians or to the people operating these scooters. There's a fairly high frequency of head injuries and other types of injuries relating to the use of some of these devices in places where they've been allowed. So on the one hand, you have the possibility that more people can get out of their cars, travel longer distances to transit, which is a good thing. On the other hand, you have potential public health impacts. You have competition for a relatively scarce amount of space that's not allocated for streets and not allocated for vehicles and not allocated for pedestrians. So I'm, unlike the previous speakers, and because I'm a journalist, I get to leave people with questions instead of solutions. The question I have is, how do we sort of think through the balance that's required in adopting these technologies and allowing them into public space? And do we need to think differently about bike lanes? Do we need to think differently about how streets are programmed? And how do we allow this type of mobility without creating unintended consequences? So thank you for your time.